Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing this lovely afternoon? Thank you so very much for tuning in to today's webinar from the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. My name is Aziz Garuba. I'm Head of Finance and Chief Commercial Officer at Mortgage Market, and I'm also an AMBA 2012 graduate, and I will be your host for today's event. But before we begin, I just want us to acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and we are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. I'm actually hosting you guys right now from Johannesburg in South Africa. And just to test the chat feature, I just want to know where everyone is joining us from around the world. So if you could just put that in the chat and let me know which city, country, area that you're from, and yeah, we'll give a shout out to all of that. I see Lima, Peru. That's pretty cool. Pretty cool. So Colorado, Toronto, Halifax, Winnipeg, Ontario, Nelson, BC. Let's see, LaSalle. Yeah, some very, very interesting places. Awesome, awesome. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar titled "Turning Data into Action: Strategies for Clear Communication." And I think many of us struggle to convey data clearly, concisely, or convincingly in our presentations. I know that's something that I have to deal with very, very often. So over the next hour, we're going to learn strategies to help plan and execute effective data communication. So ensuring that your target audience has the information and the insights that they need to act. But before we dive in, let's just go through some housekeeping. First off, I think someone asked this. We are recording this presentation, and yes, if you've been registered for today, you will automatically receive a link to the recording in your inbox in the coming days. So feel free to share the link among your network and to anyone that you feel would benefit from this session. And of course, we've tested the chat is open, so you can chat with each other and just share messages and just respond or react to parts of this presentation that you like. After the presentations today, we will be taking questions. Our speakers will be taking your questions. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll go through those during the Q&A. And yes, do ask those questions. It's a fantastic opportunity to tap into some real experts on today's topic. And yeah, use that Q&A button and don't put the questions in the chat because it may get lost in there. So now, before I introduce our presenters, I'd just like to let you know about some of the upcoming Queen's executive education programs, one specifically called Communicating Effectively with Data. And this has taken place in a virtual format in February, and it's also going to be in person at Smith Toronto in April. So if the ideas and concepts presented today really catch your attention and you want to go deeper, the Communicating Effectively with Data program is definitely for you. And we'll include links to the programs in our follow-up email. And we also can pop in the links in the chat for easy reference as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's two presenters. Matt Reesor is a leadership communications expert and continuing adjunct lecturer at Smith School of Business. His expertise lies in understanding how the dynamics of interpersonal communication and effective messaging contribute to the success of plans and ideas. And Matt has designed business communication courses at the undergraduate, the MBA, and professional master's level, successfully training thousands of students since 2013. He's also partnered with managers and executives at leading organizations of all sizes, founders of scaling new ventures, as well as public sector leaders to offer them customized training and advice. We're also joined by Dave Paradi, and he's the founder of Think Outside the Slide and has authored 10 books on effective PowerPoint presentations. And his ideas have appeared in publications around the world. Dave has been recognized by Microsoft with the Most Valuable Professional Award, so the MVP Award, for his contributions to the PowerPoint and Excel communities. And his articles and videos on virtual presenting have been viewed over 4.8 million times and liked over 17,000 times on YouTube. He's a highly rated conference speaker and has delivered more than 500 customized training sessions around the world in the last 25 years. So, Matt and Dave, welcome. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Aziz. It's great to be here.
Pleasure
Awesome.
to be here. Thanks, Aziz. I'm looking forward to the session.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And so let's get started. Matt, I think you have the floor as you'll be presenting first. So yeah, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Aziz. I'm delighted to be here today with you all. So I'll be talking for probably around 10 minutes or so at the most. And what I was wanting, my goal for today is to share four insights or four principles for effective data communication. And in thinking about how I wanted to illustrate this for you all today, I wanted to think of an example that is very contemporary, a data point that many of us have heard recently, particularly if you're living in Canada. Delighted to see so many of you joining us from around the world, by the way. That's fantastic to see. But if I was to say the number to all of you right now, 25%, I would imagine that many of you would have a clear policy, political issue come to mind, or economic issue. And that would be, of course, the threatened tariffs from President Trump in the United States. So I thought that building off that particular data point would be a good way for all of us to connect to these four principles that I wanted to share with you today. So in fact, what I'm going to do is not talk about the 25%, but a downstream repercussion of this. And I must offer a caveat before I get into this. As you can see, for those of you who are in Canada, this is Premier Doug Ford of Ontario. This is neither an endorsement of his policies or him as a politician. It's secondary. I'm here to talk about the 25% tariffs and a number that Premier Ford offered last week in a press conference regarding the impact that these tariffs would have on the province of Ontario. And specifically, he said that 500,000 Ontario jobs would be at risk. And he had a press conference last week. It lasted about 30 minutes. And this was pretty much the only data point that he offered. And so I wanted to use this as an example to illustrate these four principles that I think are most important when we're presenting data. The first idea I wanted to share with you is this concept that I have of a taproot statistic. Now, those of you who aren't botanists or gardeners may not be familiar with what a taproot is. I'm not much of a gardener myself, but a taproot is that first root that forms after a seed germinates. And after that taproot forms, all of the other roots form off it. So it feeds everything else. And we can look or think about a statistic like 500,000 as a taproot. There is lots more that you could ask about a stat like this. Maybe it leads to something like job sector breakdowns in terms of job losses. So maybe you could go on to say, based on your analysis, 120,000 jobs would be lost in manufacturing, for example, or 60,000 jobs would be lost in transportation down the stream, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be the example of feeding off that taproot statistic. But we're going to always come back to that 500,000 because that's our main message, that there's 500,000 jobs at risk. And the other statistics are going to stem off that taproot. You could also talk about things direct versus indirect job losses. So those of you or those who lose their jobs as a direct result of working in sectors where these tariffs would have an instant repercussion on the profitability of these companies, and people would instantly lose their jobs, versus downstream, those working in non-directly impacted sectors like retail, for example, but because of impacts of recession and other kinds of negative impacts within the economy, ultimately all sectors get impacted. But Premier Ford, in his press conference last week, he pretty much stuck to this 500,000. He talked a little bit about the potential for government intervention that would be necessary if these tariffs did come to pass, but he didn't go deeply into those numbers. Which brings me to my second really important point. It's very tempting, particularly for those of us who have a deep quantitative or analytical or data science background, to really want to go into the analysis for two reasons, I think. One, because that's where we're most comfortable, is talking about the numbers and how we arrived at the number that we got to. But the second reason I think that people want to live in the analysis over the implication is because it allows us to demonstrate to folks that we've thought carefully about these things. And if you're at work and you've got your boss who's asked you to present some data, you want to make it clear that you've done some work. So often we fall into this trap of stressing analysis over implications. But let me suggest to you that for the purposes of communication, your analysis is less important than your implication. Now, this is not to say that your analysis isn't important. And there are going to be times when you're going to have to demonstrate that you've done deep level analysis. In fact, if I go back to this 500,000 number from Premier Ford, there will definitely be questions and have been questions since about, well, how exactly did you arrive at this number? Show us your analysis. But we don't necessarily need to go there right off the bat. We can come to the analysis later. You don't have to show your work, as we were told in our high school math classes, perhaps. You must always be prepared to show your work, but you don't necessarily have to show it during your initial communications. Stick with the implications. Be prepared to show those analyses if necessary, but the implications should be your lead piece of communication. And from there, you can talk about things like, for example, other implications might be the negative impact on GDP, productivity, competitiveness, for example. I mentioned earlier, it could lead to a recession. So these are the kinds of implications that, based off of that 500,000 number, that Premier Ford shared last week during his press conference. Massive government spending to support those who are impacted, both on the business side and on the worker side, for example. My third point in terms of effective data communication principles is to contextualize so that people can relate to your data. It's often very difficult for people, particularly if you have a lot of numbers or big numbers, for them to really understand what this means at a personal or individual level, the impacts on an organization or on a person, for example. And it's really important that we contextualize for folks. And I want to share one of my favorite quotes from Chip and Dan Heath in their excellent book, Made to Stick. And talking about this issue, they put it this way: a good statistic is one that aids a decision or shapes an opinion. For a stat to do either of these, it must be dragged within the everyday. So let's go back and think about that 500,000 job loss number again. It's a big number, but it isn't contextualized to the extent that we can really perhaps understand as intuitively what exactly it means. But if I was to say that that means 1 in 16 Ontario workers would lose their jobs as a result of these tariffs, that has more of an impact. You can then go on to incorporate a little bit of small storytelling about, one person or two people in your children's class, for example, their parents may lose their job. A couple of people on your street where you live may lose their job. In this way, we're contextualizing the information so that people can relate to it and understand it at a personal level. And that 1 in 16, by the way, was taken from StatsCan just a few days ago in preparing for this webinar. So that's where that number comes from. My final point in communicating data is this: have an action-oriented takeaway. At the end of the day, you need to make the case that because of the data that you're presenting, the implications and the analysis, you need to have your audience move to do something, decide something, give you something, pitch your idea to someone else. You need your audience to do something. Perhaps it's even just believe you and then be on side in supporting your initiative. So back to Premier Ford, what he talked about in his press conference last week, and we've heard lots of different politicians and business leaders in Canada talking about what actions Canada should take under the threat of these tariffs. Premier Ford was about, we should be cooperating with the Americans rather than competing, and trying to appeal to President Trump and his team that that's where we should be focusing our efforts. He has this idea of Fortress AMCAN, which is really a model, or his model, and others have obviously been involved in thinking about ways that a Canadian, economies and the US economies can work together in partnership rather than putting tariffs on one another. So we have this very clear action-oriented takeaway. So again, four areas that I want you to think about when you're communicating data. Have a taproot statistic, so that main statistic that everything branches off of. Stress implications over analysis. Always contextualize so people can relate to your data more easily, and have that action-oriented takeaway. For those of you who like acronyms, maybe you could call it TICA, T-I-C-A, which is why I've capitalized and changed the colors of those letters. So my action-oriented takeaway at the end of my brief presentation is this. If you wish to learn more about these concepts, I encourage you to attend the Effective Data Communication Program that Aziz mentioned at the beginning, that Dave and I will be launching virtually in February, and then again in Toronto in April. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Dave, who's going to go into some data visualization best practices for you. Dave, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Matt. And, Matt talked about the strategic thought about our data that we need to communicate. I want to go a little more tactical and talk about the visuals, because often what we want to do is we want to use visuals to communicate that message to others. And like Matt, what I want to do is to go through some principles of effective data visuals using an example from the news media, because the news media increasingly communicates data, communicates numbers. And so this article is one that was published in the Globe and Mail last month, and it talks about how Canadian households are coping with debt loads. Specifically here, they're talking about interest payments. In interest payments, the way Statistics Canada looks at them, there are mortgage interest payments and there are non-mortgage interest payments. And when we go in and take a look at what's the key thing that they're trying to talk about is, in the third quarter, those interest payments were down 0.6%. And what contributed the most to that decline are lower non-mortgage interest. So the key message here that they want to communicate is, where did, first of all, that it went down, and where did that come down from? And so the first principle I want to really emphasize is it's very important to decide on your message. And this very much ties into what Matt was talking about in terms of the implication. Too often, people just put data out there and don't explain what it means. Executives get confused. They ask a lot of questions. If that is happening to you in your presentations, it may be because you have not decided on what that message is. And believe me, that is your job. The executive expects you to decide what that message is. It comes from your analysis, the context you have, your background with this data, the experience that you have. So the very first thing is to decide on the message. Now, this is the table from Statistics Canada that talks about the two types of interest. And I've used the red rectangle there to show you the specific two rows that are mortgage interest and non-mortgage interest. Yeah, thankfully, the Globe and Mail didn't show this, but I show it to you to illustrate principle number 2, which is a table of data is almost never the best visual. We have all sat through too many presentations with tables and tables of numbers on the slides. And unfortunately, what happens too often is that the presenter puts a table on the slide and then says, oh, now if you subtract column 8 from column 7, please do not ask your audience to do math, because they won't. That's our jobs as professionals, is to do the math, to do the analysis. A table of data is very rarely a good choice for a visual. And as I said, the Globe and Mail did not choose to use that visual. Here is the visual they did choose to use. Now, they chose this as the visual to communicate the messages about, obviously, there's an increase and then there is a decrease. But I want to use this visual and point out a few things to you on this visual that will illustrate the next 3 principles. Principle number 3 is to use a headline for your visual and not a title. A headline is like a newspaper would write a headline, and it communicates what the key message is. Unfortunately, here they have just simply used a title, total interest paid by households. It does not communicate any of the message, and it's important, I believe, that the headline communicates that message. Now, yes, you typically put it in what is called the slide title box on PowerPoint, but I believe it should be a headline. It is very important for people who look at your deck later, and you and I both know that is happening more and more and more today, is when people look at the deck later on. By simply flipping through the deck, if you have really good headlines for your data visuals, they know exactly what it means. And here's a sort of secret tip here. It's also really helpful for you as the presenter. Because if you ever get concerned about, I'm not going to remember what I need to say about this visual, look at the headline. If the headline is a good message, you can communicate that message very clearly, very easily. And then when you're done, simply move on to your next slide. It makes it a lot easier for you to deliver the presentation. Principle 4 is to make sure you have selected the graph that best communicates the message you are trying to communicate. Now, the message here that they're talking about is a message of it increased and now it is starting to decrease. Well, that is a message of a trend. But unfortunately, columns don't communicate trends very well. It's very hard, especially with a stacked column. And when they chose the stacked column, they made it almost impossible to really truly see the trend in the non-mortgage interest. Those are the blue segments in our graph here, because they do not have a common baseline. It becomes very difficult to sort of go, okay, did it increase? Did it decrease? Or was that really the purple segment down below? For trends, a line is the correct graph choice, in my opinion. And then principle 5 is to put the explanatory text close to the data. Now here, the explanatory text is the legend. Legends are very, very rarely a good idea. There are much better options. And this comes from the research of Professor John Sweller of the University of New South Wales. And what his research has showed is that putting the explanatory text, in this case, what are the two data series being shown, put that close to the data, and understanding comprehension goes up. So I took the data that was provided by Statistics Canada, and here's how I created the data visuals to communicate this. Now, what we can see here is in the last few years, interest paid by Canadians has increased dramatically, much more dramatically from mortgage interest, which is on our left-hand side here, the purple line. You can see how steep that line is. But interest has now started to decline. And typically what we would normally think is that what goes up fast would come down fast. That's actually not the case. What we see when we take a look at our last quarter, the third quarter, is that most of the decrease was actually from the non-mortgage interest, the blue line. And the mortgage interest hasn't really started to come down nearly as much as the non-mortgage interest. So let's take a look and see how I address those last three principles that I talked about. So first, I created a message headline for the slide. Even if you don't understand the visual or don't have time to look at it, that message headline tells you exactly what I need you to understand. Then I used lines instead of the stacked columns, because it's far easier to see a trend. You look at those two lines and it's very clear that the mortgage interest climbed far faster than the non-mortgage interest. And then I put the explanatory text, the labels as to what the purple and the blue lines are representing. I put that right into the graph, right above those lines. So it is not something you have to go back and forth to understand, but it's right there. Principle 6 is to make the visual clear. Now, line graphs, generally, when you create them, typically they will have lines on top of each other. This can be hard to understand depending on the data. And in this case, it would be hard because the two would essentially overlap. And it would be difficult to sort of figure out, gee, what's really going on there? So what I did here is I created what I call a panel line graph. Panel line graph places the lines beside each other on the same axis. And so it's much easier to see those trends. And indeed, the mortgage interest just pops right out as that steep, steep line. And just in case you're wondering, everything I'm showing you today is all created in plain vanilla Excel and PowerPoint. I'm not using any add-ins, plugins, scripting, programming at all. So just know that the tools you already have, that you already use every day, those are the only tools I'm using. Principle 7, tell people the full story and then focus. So what I did is I split this into two parts. I showed the overall trend first so that we could see the mortgage interest grew much faster. Then what I did, because the end of that line was so difficult to see, is I zoomed in on the end of each of those lines so that you could see very clearly, oh, that blue non-mortgage interest line, yeah, that's dropped more than the mortgage interest line. And again, I used some techniques within PowerPoint to create this graph. And finally, principle number 8 is that if you have multiple messages, use multiple slides. I was very deliberate in breaking this down to 2 slides because I wanted to make sure that the 2 messages about the context being the overall first and the focus of the drop in the last quarter were separate, that I could talk about them separately. The rule I would suggest you use is always have only one message per slide because it makes it easier to understand. It makes it easier for you to present as well. I formatted the title between these 2 slides so that it looked like I was building just more words and more focus on that second slide. So again, here's the visual that the Globe presented, the original stacked column visual. And here are the 2 slides that I created that I believe are an example of communicating a data visual more effectively. Now, if you're feeling a little discouraged by it, saying, hey, I'm not familiar with these principles, I was never taught any of this, please don't be discouraged, because this is not taught in school. It's not taught in high school, in university, in graduate, in professional designations. And everybody's just kind of doing their best from what they've seen from other folks. And so that's one of the reasons when Matt and I do our programs, we're trying to bring awareness to the ways that professionals can improve the way that they communicate data. And so what I did was, because I had a couple minutes in my time, I wanted to show you a bonus example. And this is from this morning's Globe and Mail. So this morning, the Globe and Mail talked about in one of their articles, the growth of ETFs in Canada, the different types of ETFs, and they used a column graph. Again, the message here is about growth, the trend, not the individual numbers. And you can see that these are 5-year segments, not 1-year segments. So what I did though, is I looked at it again and I said, what are those principles? Go back. And this is the visual that I created. So now it's very easy to see that key message that Canadian listed active ETFs are going faster than the other 2 types. We see them, this case, putting the lines on top of each other made a lot of sense. And the labeling, I took it away from the legend and made it direct labels on the lines. So these are just some examples that you can use to think about how can I apply these 8 principles to the data visual that I create and the presentations that I deliver to executives. Aziz, we'll send it back to you.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Matt. Those were really, really good, insightful presentations. And I'm sure, folks have questions. So once again, if you do have questions, just put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. But before I get to the audience questions, let me just ask a couple of my own. And I think, there's something important about definitely tailoring your presentation to different audiences. I have to do that quite a bit. And I, recognize or remember, when I was working more in the finance function, my audience was a lot of finance executives. And as I moved up, it became more business leaders and business partners. So how do you handle situations where the data needs to appeal to multiple audiences who have different backgrounds or levels of expertise? And Matt, maybe I'll pose this one to you.
I think it's a very, very common problem, Aziz. I think one of the myths of that we hear when people like me are teaching about principles of audience analysis is that there's this kind of homogeneous audience that we all get to deal with, and we can speak to them all with one voice, and they'll understand our message very clearly. Very, very rarely is that the case. I think the first thing that you need to do is, first of all, understand that, let's say if it is a group of executives you're presenting to, and then you've got a group of more technical folks afterwards. Clearly, the executive folks are going to want much more high level strategic, what's the business impact, much more on the implications. You might get one or two, though, who are going to say, okay, I need to see your math on this. So as I said earlier, you need to be prepared to show your work. But one of the things actually that Dave and I talk about a lot is that if you've got a mixed audience in the room, for example, you've got folks who are very technical, for example, or who have operational needs versus more executive level needs, is that there's some work that you can do before that meeting even starts. If you have time to do this, if it hasn't been a meeting that's just come across your agenda suddenly, is that if I'm going into a meeting and I'm presenting data to a group of mixed background in terms of their expertise, experience with the concepts that I'll be talking about, then it's always great to use that kind of pre-read opportunity and sending out information beforehand so I can get folks up to speed who may need to, and those who already know everything can basically read the executive summary or ignore it in totality. So I think the preparation beforehand can be helpful as well when you have those mixed groups, is just making sure that you get people up to speed as much as possible. You're always walking that line between making sure that people feel comfortable and condescending to people. And I think that's one of the trickiest things when we're doing these kinds of presentations, is we don't want to feel like we're wasting people's time by telling them things that they already know, but we don't want to condescend either. And I think that's where that pre-work that you can do to get people up to speed goes a long way in preventing those kinds of problems from occurring.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.
And Aziz,
and
if I just
sure.
just add on that, in terms of a couple of features within PowerPoint that allow you to do this, one of the things you can do is use a feature called custom shows. Custom shows allows you to create a presentation with choosing different slides in different orders. You can deliver that, and you can create a handout from that. So you could have the executive version, you could have the manager version, you could have the supervisor version. This is better than creating multiple presentations because everything is always drawing from the same set of slides. You don't have to remember, oh yeah, I got to remember to update that slide in that other version, because we all know we've missed that before. And the other thing to remember is when Matt talks about being able to jump to different slides, or let's say an executive asks a question or somebody asks a question. One of the things, if you're using presenter view in PowerPoint, in the last 18 months, they added a key that makes this super easy. So if you press the G key, G for grid, what it does, it allows you to see all of your slides, scroll through it, click on the next one. And to the audience, they just see that next slide come up. They don't know it's 27 slides down, and then you can jump back to wherever you want. So it gives you those tools in your back pocket to adapt on the fly as well.
Amazing. I'm taking notes. I didn't know about that custom show feature in PowerPoint. So that's a really cool one. So I'll just ask one of the questions from the audience. So Kareem asks, so hi Dave, what was the benefit of putting two graphs separately versus two lines within the same slide?
So the benefit of separating the two lines is that if the lines are going to be overlapping, and that's what would have been for much of it here, you lose the clarity. And so in the first example that I talked about, I separated the two because I wanted you to see they were about the same, and then this dramatic rise for one and not so dramatic for the other. The bonus example that I showed, I put the lines on top of each other because there wasn't a lot of commonality between them. So it was very easy to see the distinction. So it's, again, one of those things where you're thinking about, how is the audience going to be able to understand this? Is it going to be easy enough for them to understand? So that was the decision thinking that I had.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Dave. And Matt, maybe I'll ask you this question. If it's a question from Hassel, if you are not a data scientist or analyst, could I figure out how to make clear data visuals using Excel and PowerPoint? Are there any tips or tutorials? Actually, maybe this is more for Dave. Are there any tips you recommend for learning how to use this program in this way, especially if you're not an analytical person?
Before I hand it over to Dave, and it absolutely is his question to answer. I forgot the name. Was Hazel? Was that the name?
Yes, yeah.
Excellent question. I myself am not a data scientist, and I rely on folks around me to help me when it comes to doing the kinds of things that Dave showed today. So, anyways, I'll hand it over to him to answer that question.
And I just want to build on what Matt just said, is even if you're not a data scientist or analyst, it's important that you understand how to be able to judge a visual that someone has created for you. Because it's important, if you're the one going to be delivering it, you have to do that. Now, to get to the specific of the question of how do you learn how to do this? Well, you need to look for people who can steer you in the right direction. And so as Aziz, and part of my introduction is I am recognized by Microsoft as one of the most valuable professionals. There are a group of Excel most valuable professionals, and they do training in a lot of this. If you look for some of their YouTube channels, they have an absolute ton of free information on Excel on the analysis side, as well as on creating visuals. John Peltier is one of the MVPs who's known worldwide as a great data visual person. His YouTube channel and his blog has a ton of great information. My YouTube channel, I have dozens of tutorials where I show you exactly in the software how to do it. But I would just caution, if you do not have the principles in place knowing what you want to create, the knowing how isn't going to be helpful. It really is only predicated on what Matt and I said about here are the principles to determine what you need to create so that you know what you're actually going to apply those techniques. Just knowing the techniques is not enough.
And if I could reinforce that, just as Dave was saying, that it all comes back to the message. What is your message? What are you trying to say? What's your goal? What are you trying to achieve by sharing this kind of information that you're sharing with your audience? And sometimes I think I've seen some of the chat people talking about great BI tools and data viz tools like Tableau, for example. There's great products out there, but it's very easy for us to fall, actually, in their book Data Fluency. I forget the name of the brothers who wrote it at the moment, but they talk about one of the traps that people fall into is they call it the supermodel, wherein that you have all this data and you can make this incredible visualization and it looks great, but your message is completely obscured because there's too much going on, and it may be a wonderful looking aesthetically piece of data visualization, but it's actually obscuring your message, and it confuses people, and it can confuse your audience and yourself as well. So it all comes back to what exactly are you trying to say, and what are you trying to achieve with this data that you're sharing with your audience.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt, for bringing that. I think that actually leads me into my next question. So what if the data doesn't seem to tell that compelling story on its own? And how do you handle situations where the data is complex or inconclusive, but you still have to present it effectively?
I think it comes back to, first of all, you have to start with an ethical honesty about what the data is telling you and what it isn't. Growing up, there was a gentleman who lived across the street from us, road from us. I lived in the country, and he was a farmer. And he used to say, figures don't lie, but liars sure can figure. And sometimes we fall for that trap of, okay, the data isn't exactly saying what I need it to say, so I can leave this bit out, or I can add this bit here, and you end up obviously telling a completely false message. So I think part of it is understanding is that I could get into the whole conversation on the philosophy of science and what we can know for certain and what we can't. But I would say in most cases, the data doesn't give us a very 100% clear answer that this is what we need to do. Data is complex. There's multiple variables. Correlation is a very complex subject. So I think data always needs to be supported by other insights as well, be they based on intuition, be they based on experience, be they based on consultations and qualitative data or qualitative information you've gathered from others. So I think being overly reliant on data or fully reliant on data is not something I'd recommend anyway. So I always come back to, you have to behave as ethically as you can. If the data doesn't quite tell the story that you wish it would, or you're missing some data, then you can be honest with the folks that you're speaking with that this is where I think the data is leading us, but actually right now I'm seeing some gaps, and here's the information I need to gather going forward. That would be my advice on that one.
Awesome. Awesome. Makes perfect sense. And Dave, a question for you, maybe from Anthony. How much psychology do you leverage in your data visualizations?
Well, I don't have a psychology background, so I'm not really sure how much I might or might not be leveraging. What I would say is that, it's about understanding what the audience needs and delivering what they need. So whether that is understanding what level is the audience at in terms of their decision-making power, what level are they at in terms of their knowledge about the subject that you're talking about, even as granular as acronyms. And oh my gosh, do we have a lot of acronyms in business today. And the challenge with acronyms is I might have an acronym that I use, and I saw a couple of chat popping up. I used an acronym EFT, and people are wondering, what's an EFT? What's an EFT? Because I never explained it. I know because I have an investment industry background. You know because you have investment industry background. It's an exchange traded fund. So the real thing is to make sure that you are delivering honestly with your best intentions to deliver what the audience needs. When I hear people say how much psychology you use, my concern is that people need to or are thinking we need to use psychological tricks to try to convince somebody. And my experience is that if you try to trick someone, they're going to figure out far faster than you could ever imagine. And you have just damaged your credibility, not just for now, but for the future as well. And they start to distrust all the rest of the information that you provide for them. So I see this in the data visuals. I see this where people change the axis of a graph. So they start it at not zero, and they make differences or values look bigger or smaller than they are. Right. And once somebody figures out you're trying to manipulate them, they go, hold on, I'm trying to be manipulated so much today, I don't like that. And they tune you out. So it's very, very careful about, that integrity of the message. And as Matt was just saying in the answer to the previous question, sometimes your only presentation is, here's what we are missing, and here's how we need to get that data to be able to give you some answers. And maybe that's all you can say at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, those are some very cogent points, and I think that hits home quite well for a lot of folks, is making sure that you're not trying to pull a fast one on your audience, and I think you'll retain your credibility by doing that. All right, so next question is from Nancy. Do you think PowerPoint and decks are overused in business, and what do you think of Amazon's no presentation practice and using memos instead? Matt, Dave, whoever wants to take this one, I think
I've written a couple of articles on this specifically about the whole Amazon approach on this, and you can find them on my LinkedIn page. But the reality is that every time you have to decide how you are going to communicate, and there are many different ways to communicate. Do people rely too much on a particular communication vehicle at times? Yes. Are some organizations too reliant on PowerPoint? Yes, I had one of my clients where they stopped sending emails that had text in them. They would just create a slide and send that. No, that's going overboard. I think we can all agree on that one. What PowerPoint does, I believe, is allows us to have some advantages in terms of using visuals and having something that is available afterwards. When you look at Amazon's approach, so their approach, for those of you not familiar with it, what they do is they ask people to create a memo. They all come to the room, sit there and read through the memo, and then they have the discussion. So my concern with that is, does somebody have the time to read something and go, huh, that's not my experience. I'm going to go, I want to check that with so-and-so to see what our department is experienced. And so what Matt said, sending something in advance may actually help people to come better prepared for that discussion. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each approach. I don't think there's one approach that is the solution. There are many solutions, but is any tool poorly used? Yes. And if you actually look at some of the evidence from Amazon, that there are people who don't write very good memos there, and their meetings aren't very good either. So there's no easy solution.
Cool, cool. And Matt, are there any tips for clear communication? This is a question from Richie. Any tips for clear communication from an accessibility perspective? So like hearing, eyesight impaired, anything else?
I think, yes, obviously there are. And I think this comes back to, again, the preparation for knowing who our audience is and what their needs are. I've had the opportunity, for example, to present ideas in lots of different contexts around the world, often with folks who, for example, maybe English is their third or fourth language. And that doesn't mean that I avoid condescension, but I will avoid things like using a lot of idioms that are familiar to me in the context that I grew up with in Ontario that may not translate well to other places. I also have neurodivergent people in my family. So I'm always very conscious of when we are giving best practices around, well, this is how you establish credibility as a presenter, for example. This is how you use your eyes. This is how you use your body, for example. There's lots of neurodivergent folks for whom that's just, they cannot communicate that way, and it would make them very uncomfortable to be put in that position to do so. Back to eye contact, of course, that's also, you're in South Africa right now, Aziz. There are lots of places, and I'm not saying South Africa is one of them, where I grew up in a place where you're always holding eye contact. That's what you're expected to do to maintain credibility. But I've done a lot of work in South Asia, the Middle East, where eye contact can be seen as much more intimidating and disrespectful. So I think there's always things that we can do in terms of accessibility and making sure that we're presenting our ideas in a way that's going to be as relatable and understandable to people as possible. And if I'm in an environment where I'm not familiar, maybe I do have some folks who have some some accessibility needs with which I'm not familiar, I will ask, how can I and what can I do in order to make sure that I'm presenting this information to you in a way that's going to be most accessible and meaningful to you. So yeah, I think it goes back to, again, being willing to ask and being humble, and then being respectful enough to say, okay, I'm going to have to adapt and change here based on the circumstances of what this audience needs in order for me to be effective.
And one of the other things that people can do is check out the accessibility checker that's built into PowerPoint. It will go through and check your slides and flag to you any accessibility issues, such as adding alt text to graphs or images, or make sure that text is readable. So use that tool. It's built into PowerPoint already. So use that to give you a heads up on some of those issues that you can preemptively address.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think I remember in the presentations class that I took during the AMBA program, one of the things that we were always told was, also design your presentations for the room that it's going to be in, right? Not putting tiny fonts when the distance between the screen and the audience is very, very far. So just making taking note of where this information is going to actually be presented. Okay, so let's go on to some more questions. This one's from Aaron. Analysis that I do is often presented by others, and the message can become warped or misleading. Do you have any suggestions for ensuring that the intended message is maintained?
That's a great question, Aaron. It's very, very common for us to be in a position where either we're presenting someone else's material or we're having others present it on our behalf. This goes back to what I guess two principles I can share with you. One is it's really, really important in these situations that you are as concise as possible, that you understand what your main message, key messages, controlling idea, whatever you want to call it, are for that message, and that they are front and center, so that if nothing else, folks know what that main message is. The second tip that I would give is that if I am asked to present someone else's material for them, and I know this isn't always possible, but I like to sit down with them as if they were the audience, and first of all ask them, get more information about, so what exactly is the goal of this particular communication? What are we trying to achieve? Who's going to be there? Are there contextual issues that I need to be aware of? And then actually presenting it to them to get their feedback about, so am I doing this in a way that's appropriate? Does this make sense? Where possible, and it's not always possible, I find it very, very difficult to present other people's PowerPoint slides. We all have our own unique ways of thinking. And if possible, if I was presenting someone else's information, I would work with them to see if I could still maintain those key messages, but tweak it in a way that feels that it would align better with my structure and my particular communication style. So those would be a few things I would say. But yeah, Aaron, it's a really difficult thing to do. So yeah, be concise, stick to those key messages, and work with that the person who's familiar with that presentation and that audience as much as possible. Would be a couple of tips for me.
Awesome. And Dave, this next question I think is going to be for you. It's from Beverly. How do you influence the reporting design changes to senior leaders if they're used to traditional graphs?
This is something that comes up regularly after people attend our sessions. They go, "Oh, there's all these changes I want to make. I'm going to have a completely new presentation next month for the executives." And I say, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa! Don't do that. Change is not something everybody is comfortable with, and executive reporting is one of those areas. So what I usually suggest is change no more than 10% of a presentation, regular, scheduled type presentation at any one time. So maybe you've got 20 slots in the regular monthly report. Maybe only change 2. Next month, maybe change another 2. And you're doing the math, you're going, Dave, like that's going to be the entire year before I get them all done. Yep. But you have a better chance of getting somebody to accept that change if it's small and incremental. Because if they notice on the second month, hey, that's a little bit different to what we normally see. Oh no, it's the same as we did last month. And what happens is it helps for them to see it. And again, depending on your scenarios, as Matt has said, maybe you preview it to those senior people in advance before the presentation, maybe a couple of them, to make sure that they're going to be okay. And often what happens is when they see a more effective visual, they go, "Oh, that's good." And here's where your concern comes in, because now they want you to do it for all other 12 presentations you have to do this month. And you've just given yourself a ton more work. But that's actually good work. It's good work because it's moving the organization forward. But take that change slowly. You can't push too fast. It's just not going to happen. Introduce it small, slow, and get that feedback.
Awesome. And maybe as we get close to the end, Dave, I'm going to ask you this last question from Marie. And given that you're the MVP with Microsoft, have you used Copilot? And if so, did you find it helpful or did you still need to go and manually fix content for the presentations?
Okay. So as an MVP, we see things before they get released. Okay. So I can talk about things that are public. I can't talk about stuff that isn't public. And this is the comment I have given to the Microsoft development team. I have said to them, I do not believe in PowerPoint, and I'm only talking about Copilot and PowerPoint here, not Copilot and other apps, okay? I said, I do not believe you will ever be able to live up to what marketing has put out there from the start. Their marketing department, unfortunately, put out there, you just give it one sentence. Do this month's sales reporting. And it would go out, get all the data, do the visuals, create your presentation, everything. That is impossible. It is not possible for it to ever do that. So I think we have to be very, very careful about our expectations. And I think, unfortunately, the expectations were set too high. Copilot, again, like all AI, is based on large language models, LLMs, and PowerPoint is not primarily a language-based communication vehicle. Word is, Outlook is, transcripts of this meeting would be, but it's very hard. And that's why they've struggled in PowerPoint. They've struggled in Excel. And Excel Copilot, really all it does is it writes Python code. And did you sign up to be a Python code editor and checker? I don't think so. No. So I think we have to be careful about the expectations within some of these non-primarily language type of apps. My advice, and I sent this out last year to all of my clients, I said, I do not think it's worth $30 a month to pay for it if you're primarily using it for PowerPoint. Some of the other apps, maybe, but it's not there. And I'm not sure it's ever going to live up to the expectations, the unrealistic expectations, in my opinion, that marketing put out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Matt. This has been a very fantastic session, and I hope everyone has gotten some really, really good understanding and insights from it. But we're almost out of time. Before we wrap up, though, I just want to remind everyone about the Queen's Executive Education Program that expands on what we've just talked about today. So it's communicating effectively with data, and it's being offered in two formats. So you can attend remotely from anywhere in the world with the virtual program that's running in February. I believe it's on the 12th, the 13th, 19th, and 20th. And if you're in the GTA, you can also attend this program in person, and it's taking place in April on the 23rd and 24th of April, downtown Toronto at our Smith Toronto facility. And this program is going to go beyond the training, the presentation training, to address the use of data to tell that compelling story that supports any business case for any given audience. And you're going to leave with concrete skills that you can actually immediately apply to the data you use in your own role. So head over to smithqueens.com/execed or scan the QR codes that are on the screen right now to learn more. And we'll also include the links to the programs in our follow-up email, which you will receive this week, along with the video for today's session. So that's it from us, Dave and Matt. Thank you again for much of these fantastic insights. We really appreciate it. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone has. And from the Smith School of Business at Queen's University, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Our next webinar will be coming up soon, so keep an eye out in your inboxes for more information, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, Aziz. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Aziz. Thanks, everyone.